Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them by Susan Forward and Joan Torres. A personal introduction. Nobody in his right mind would stay with someone in my condition. The only reason Jeff stays is because he loves me. When Nancy first came to see me, she was 60 pounds overweight and had an ulcer. She wore old, baggy jeans and a shapeless smock. Her hair was stringy, her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, and her hands shook. When she had married Jeff 4 years before, she had been a fashion coordinator for a major Los Angeles department store. In her work, she had traveled through Europe and the Orient, selecting designer clothes for the store. She had always dressed in the latest fashions and dated fascinating men. She had been written about in a number of articles on successful women in the Los Angeles area, and she had accomplished this before she was 30. Yet, when I first saw her at age 34, she was so ashamed of how she looked and felt about herself that she seldom left home. The decline of Nancy's self esteem seemed to have begun when she married Jeff. Yet, when I questioned her about her husband, she began with a long list of superlatives. He's a wonderful man. He's charming and witty and dynamic. He's always doing little things for me. He sent me flowers to commemorate the anniversary of the first night we've made love. Last year, he bought two surprise tickets to Italy for my birthday. She told me that Jeff, a busy and successful entertainment lawyer, always found time to spend with her, and that despite her current appearance, he still wanted her along for all his business dinners and outings. I used to love going out with him with his clients because we'd still hold hands like high school lovers. I'm the envy of all my friends because of him. One friend said, "You've got the special one, Nancy." And I know he is. But look at me. I don't understand what's happened. I feel so low all the time. I've got to get myself back together or I'm going to lose him. A man like Jeff doesn't have to lug around a wife like me. He can have anyone he wants, including movie stars. I'm lucky he's hung in as long as he has. As I listened to Nancy and observed her appearance, I asked myself, what's wrong with this picture? There was a basic contradiction here. Why would a competent and effective woman in a loving relationship get so ground down? What had happened to her in the 4 years of her marriage to make such a marked change in both her appearance and her sense of self worth? I pressed her to tell me more about her relationship with Jeff. Bit by bit, a fuller picture emerged. I guess the only thing that really bothers me about him is how much he flies off the handle. What do you mean by fly off the handle? I asked. She laughed a little. He does what I call his King Kong imitation, yelling and making lots of noise. He also puts me down a lot, like he did the other night when we were having dinner with his friends. He was talking about a play, and I interjected something, and he just snapped at me. Why don't you shut up? Then he said to our friends, don't pay any attention to her. She's always got something stupid to say. I was so humiliated, I felt like sinking into the upholstery. I could hardly swallow my food afterwards. Nancy began to cry as she recalled several other humiliating scenes in which Jeff had called her stupid, selfish, or thoughtless. When enraged, he would often yell at her, slam doors, and throw things. The more I questioned her, the clearer the picture became. Here was a woman trying desperately to figure out how to please a husband who was often angry and intimidating as well as charming. Nancy said she often felt asleep long after he did, with his cruel words stinging in her ears. During the day, she had fits of crying for no apparent reason. It was at Jeff's insistence that Nancy had quit her job when they married. Now she felt incapable of returning to her career, as she described it. Now I wouldn't even have the nerve to go on an interview, much less a buy-in trip. I don't feel like I could make the decisions anymore because I've lost confidence in myself. Jeff made all the decisions in their marriage. He insisted on total control of every aspect of their life together. He oversaw all spending, selected the people with whom they socialized, and even made decisions about what Nancy should do while he was at work. He derided her for any opinion she had that differed from his, and he yelled at her, even in public, whenever he was displeased. Any deviation on her part from the course he had set for them resulted in a high-do scene. I told Nancy we had a lot of work to do, but I assured her she would begin to feel less overwhelmed. I told her we would take a hard look at her relationship with Jeff, and that the self-confidence she thought she'd lost was not really gone, only misplaced. Together, we would get it back again. When she left that first session, she felt a little steadier and less lost, but I began to feel shaky. Nancy's story had hit me very hard. I knew that as a therapist, my reactions to a client were important tools. I make emotional connections with the people I work with, which helps me understand more quickly how they are feeling. But this was something else. This was not the first time a woman had come to see me with this type of problem, nor was it the first time I had reacted so strongly. I could no longer deny that what was affecting me was the fact that Nancy's situation was too close to my own. On the outside, I appeared confident, fulfilled, a woman who truly had it all day long, at my office, at the hospital, and the clinic where I practiced, I worked with people to help them find confidence and a renewed sense of their own strength. But at home, it was another story. My husband, like Nancy's, was charming, sexy, and romantic, and I had fallen madly in love with him almost immediately after we met. But I soon discovered that he had a great deal of anger inside him, and that he had the power to make me feel small, inadequate, and off balance. He insisted on being in control of everything I did, believed, and felt. The Susan, who was a therapist, could say to Nancy, "Your husband's behavior doesn't sound loving. In fact, it sounds as if there's a lot of psychological abuse going on." But what was I saying to myself? The Susan who went home at night twisted herself into a pretzel, trying to keep her husband from yelling at her. That Susan kept telling herself that he was a wonderful man, that he was exciting to be with, and that therefore, if something went wrong, it must be her fault. Over the next few months, I looked more closely at what was going on both in my own marriage and in the relationship of my clients who appeared to be in similar situations. What was really happening here? What were the patterns? Although it was the women who usually sought my help, it was the behavior of the men that claimed my attention. As their partners described them, they were often charming and even loving, but they were able to switch to cruel, critical, and insulting behavior on a moment's notice. Their behavior covered a wide spectrum, from obvious intimidation and threats to more subtle, covert attacks which took the form of constant put downs or erosive criticism. Whatever the style, the results were the same. The man gained control by grinding the woman down. These men also refused to take any responsibility for how their attacks made their partners feel. Instead, they blamed their wives or lovers for any and every unpleasant event. I knew from my experience in working with couples that every marriage has two sides. However, it's easy for therapists to over identify with the client when we only hear one side of the story. Certainly, each partner contributes to whatever turmoil and conflict exists in a relationship. But once I began seeing some of my clients' male partners in counseling, I realized that they did not suffer nearly as much as they caused their partners to suffer. It was the women who were in pain. All of them had dramatic losses of self esteem, and many had additional symptoms and reactions. Nancy had ulcers, was overweight, and had let her appearance go. Others had severe problems with drug and or alcohol abuse, migraines, gastrointestinal complaints, eating disorders, and sleeping disorders. Their job performance had often suffered. Their once promising careers had declined. Previously successful and competent women found themselves doubting their skills and their judgment. They experienced depressions, crying spells, and anxiety with alarming frequency. In every case, these problems had begun to appear during the partnership or marriage. As I realized that I was seeing a distinct pattern in these relationships, I began to discuss it with my colleagues. They were all familiar with the type of man I described. Each had treated women who either had been married to, had been in love with, or were the daughters of men who fit my description. What was so surprising to me was that while the type of behavior was so familiar to all of us, no one had yet described it in a cohesive way. At this point, I started reviewing the psychological literature. Because of the man's lack of sensitivity to the pain he was causing his partner, I first re examined character disorders. People with character disorders have little capacity for guilt, remorse, or anxiety. These emotions are uncomfortable but necessary monitors of our ethical and moral interactions with other people. I knew that there were two major types of recognized character disorders. First, there are the narcissists. These are people who are totally self obsessed. They tend to make relationships primarily in order to be reassured of their own specialness in the world. Men who fall into this category often flit from one relationship to another in search of love and admiration. Some familiar names for this type of men are Peter Pans and Don Juans. They have been called the people who cannot love. The men in the relationships I was looking at were different. They appeared to love intensely, and in many cases, they had been in a long term relationship with one partner. Also, their primary need differed from that of the narcissist, in that they seemed to need to control more than they needed to be admired. At the other end of the character disorder spectrum were the more extremes and dangerous sociopaths. These are people who create a whirlwind of chaos in their lives. They use and exploit anyone who comes into their orbit. Lies and deception are second nature to them. They can range from common criminals to prominent and successful professionals who are chronically involved in white collar crime. The most striking feature about sociopaths is their loco lack of conscience. But the man I was attempting to define was often genuinely responsible and competent in his dealings with society. His destructive behavior was not generalized, as was that of the sociopath. In fact, it was very focused. Unfortunately, it was focused almost exclusively on his partner. He used for weapons his words and his moods. While he tended not to physically abuse the woman in his life, he systematically wore her down through psychological battering, which in the end is every bit as emotionally devastating as physical violence. I wondered whether these men got some sort of perverse pleasure out of the pain and suffering they were causing their partners. They, in fact, sadists. After all, many of the people I discussed my discoveries with assured me that the women involved with these men were classic textbook masochists. This made me angry. I knew that the labeling of women in unhealthy relationships as masochistic, that is, seeking and enjoying suffering, has long been a standard practice in my profession and in our culture. This is a convenient but highly dangerous way of attempting to explain why so many women fall into self denying, submissive behavior with men. In reality, women learn these behaviors early and are consistently rewarded and praised for them. The paradox here is that the behaviors that make a woman vulnerable to mistreatment are the very ones she had been taught are feminine and lovable. The concept of masochism is particularly dangerous because it serves to justify aggression against women. It confirms that that's what women really want. As I talked more extensively with the couples I was counseling, I found that neither of these terms applied. Rather than get an emotional or sexual pleasure from his partner's pain, as the sadist does, the man I was attempting to define felt both threatened and enraged by his partner's suffering. The woman was not more masochist than the man was a sadist. She did not get any hidden sexual or emotional pleasure from her partner's abusive treatment of her. Instead, it severely demoralized her. Once again, I found that the psychological categories and terminology were not adequate to describe what I was seeing in these relationships. The man I was attempting to define did not appear in the literature. He was not a clear cut sociopath, narcissist, or sadist, although some of these elements were often present in his character. The most dramatic difference between this man and those described in the psychological literature was that he was capable of engaging in long term relationship with one woman. In fact, his love seemed particularly hot and intense. The tragic part was that he did everything he could to destroy the woman he professed to love so deeply. I know as a therapist that the words I love you don't necessarily indicate what's going on in a relationship. I know that it is behavior, not words, that defines reality. As I listen to my clients, I ask myself, is this the way you treat someone you really love? Isn't this, in fact, the way you treat someone you hate? Extracted from the book Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them by Dr. Susan Forward. If you'd like to have access to the full book, click the link in the description of the video. Thank you.